The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla sat quietly in her private sitting room. She held a cup of tea with trembling hands, watching the steam rise slowly into the air. The newspaper on her lap remained unread, its headlines about royal duties and public appearances seeming distant and unimportant now. Charles had been different lately. She noticed it in the way he looked past her during conversations, how his mind seemed to wander to other thoughts even when they were alone together. The man who once sought her company above all others now seemed to find reasons to be elsewhere. The change had been gradual at first. Small things that she told herself were nothing to worry about. He would finish his breakfast quickly and excuse himself for urgent meetings. Their evening walks through the gardens became less frequent. The comfortable silences they once shared now felt heavy and awkward. Camilla thought back to their early days together, when Charles would light up whenever she entered a room. They would talk for hours about everything and nothing, finding joy in the simple pleasure of each other's company. Those memories felt like they belonged to different people now. She rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured grounds. Staff members moved about their duties with quiet efficiency, just as they had for decades. The world continued to turn, obligations continued to demand attention, and life went on regardless of the personal storms that might be brewing behind closed doors. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who had grown older, perhaps more tired than she realized. The crown had brought many things into her life, but it had also taken away the simple certainties she once enjoyed. Being queen consort meant living under constant scrutiny, where every gesture was analyzed and every expression studied for hidden meanings. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made her turn. Charles appeared in the doorway, dressed formally for his morning appointments. He gave her a polite smile, the kind reserved for dignitaries and distant relatives. "Good morning, Camilla. I hope you slept well." His tone was courteous but distant. She searched his face for warmth, for some sign of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Instead, she found only the careful composure of a king performing his duties. "Good morning, Charles. Will you be back for lunch?" He consulted his schedule, a thick, leather-bound diary that had become his constant companion. "I'm afraid not. There are several meetings this afternoon, and then I have that reception for the Commonwealth delegates." She nodded, trying to keep disappointment from showing on her face. There was always something, always another obligation that took precedence over their time together. She understood the demands of the crown, had accepted them when she chose this life. But understanding and accepting were different from finding peace with them. After Charles left, Camilla found herself walking through rooms that suddenly felt too large and too quiet. The castle, with all its grandeur and history, could not fill the growing emptiness she felt inside. She picked up a book from the side table, one of the romance novels she enjoyed reading in private, but the words blurred together as her mind wandered. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Her private secretary informed her of a charity luncheon next week, a hospital opening the following month, and a request for her patronage of a new literacy program. Each obligation was worthy and important, but they felt like weights being added to an already heavy load. She agreed to everything as she always did. Being queen consort meant saying yes to almost every request, showing up with a smile, and playing her part in the endless performance of royal duty. But lately, each public appearance felt more difficult, each smile more forced. As afternoon arrived, Camilla made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of attending the garden party she had committed to weeks earlier, she asked her secretary to send her regrets. She needed time to think, time to figure out what was happening to her marriage and her role in this ancient institution. She spent the rest of the day in solitude, walking through the private apartments and reflecting on the choices that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once been confident in her place beside Charles now felt uncertain about everything. The future, which had once seemed so clear and bright, now appeared clouded with doubt and questions she was afraid to ask. The state dining room buzzed with quiet conversation as King Charles reviewed the guest list for the upcoming diplomatic dinner. His aide pointed to various names, explaining the seating arrangements and protocol requirements, but Charles found his attention drifting. Through the tall windows, he could see the gardens where he and Camilla used to take their evening walks. Something had shifted in recent months, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly when it began. The easy companionship he had always shared with Camilla now felt strained. Their conversations had become polite and surface level, lacking the depth and warmth that had sustained their relationship through so many years and challenges. Charles set down the papers and rubbed his temples. The weight of the crown seemed heavier lately, not just because of the endless duties and responsibilities, but because he felt increasingly alone in carrying them. Camilla had always been his anchor, the person who could make him laugh when the burden felt too great. Now, even when they were in the same room, he felt a distance between them that he didn't know how to bridge. His private secretary entered with updates about the week's engagements. As they discussed the details, Charles noticed that many of Camilla's scheduled appearances had been quietly canceled or postponed. When he inquired about this, he was told that the queen consort was feeling unwell and needed to rest. This pattern had been developing for weeks. Camilla, who had always been reliable and present for her duties, was increasingly absent from public events. The official explanations were always reasonable: a minor illness, a scheduling conflict, the need for rest, but Charles sensed something deeper was troubling her. After his meetings concluded, Charles found himself walking through the castle's corridors, unconsciously following the path to Camilla's private sitting room. He paused outside the door, hearing the faint sound of classical music playing within. For a moment he considered knocking, but something held him back. The gulf between them felt too wide to cross with a simple conversation. Instead, he continued to his own study, where stacks of state papers waited for his attention. The red dispatch boxes contained matters of national importance: economic policies, international relations, constitutional questions that required his careful consideration. But as he tried to focus on these weighty matters, his mind kept returning to more personal concerns. Charles thought about the early days of their marriage, when they had faced public scrutiny and criticism together. Camilla had shown remarkable strength and grace under pressure, winning over skeptics through her dedication and genuine warmth. She had transformed from a controversial figure into a respected member of the royal family, earning admiration for her charitable work and her unwavering support of him. But now, when he needed that partnership most, something fundamental had changed. The woman who had once been his closest confidant now seemed like a stranger, polite but distant, present in body, but somehow absent in spirit. He wondered if the pressure of being queen consort had become too much for her, or if there was something else, something he was missing entirely. The afternoon brought a series of private audiences with government ministers and foreign ambassadors. Charles performed his duties with the skill and experience of decades, but part of his mind remained focused on the growing crisis in his personal life. He found himself distracted during important conversations, having to ask for clarification on points he should have understood immediately. During a brief break between appointments, Charles called his private secretary and asked about Camilla's schedule for the remainder of the week. He learned that she had canceled almost everything except the most essential ceremonial duties. The explanation given was that she needed to focus on her health and well-being. But Charles suspected there was more to the story. As evening approached, he made his way to the private dining room, hoping to share dinner with Camilla as they had done for so many years. But when he arrived, he was informed that she had requested a tray be sent to her rooms instead. She was tired, the staff explained, and preferred to rest quietly. Charles ate alone in the grand dining room, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors and the weight of centuries of royal tradition. The irony was not lost on him. He was the King of England, one of the most powerful positions in the world. Yet he felt powerless to address the problems in his own marriage. After dinner, he stood at the window of his study, looking out at the gardens that were slowly disappearing into darkness. Somewhere in the castle, Camilla was also alone, dealing with whatever thoughts and feelings were causing her to withdraw from the life they had built together. Charles realized that his focus had indeed been shifting, though he hadn't consciously acknowledged it until now. The demands of kingship were pulling him in directions that left little room for the personal attention his marriage required. But recognizing the problem and solving it were two entirely different challenges, and he wasn't sure he possessed the tools needed for the latter. The morning light streamed through the windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine prepared for another day of royal engagements. She stood before her dressing mirror, adjusting the simple but elegant blue dress she had chosen for the children's hospital visit. Her reflection showed a woman who had grown comfortable in her role as Princess of Wales, confident in her ability to connect with people and carry out her duties with grace. William entered the room, already dressed in his naval uniform for a separate engagement. He kissed her cheek gently and reviewed their schedules together, a routine they had established to coordinate their busy lives while maintaining their partnership as both husband and wife and working royals. The king specifically requested that you attend the state dinner next week, William mentioned, consulting his notes. Apparently, your presence would be particularly valuable for the international relations aspect. Catherine nodded, though she noticed that these special requests from Charles had become more frequent lately. She had always enjoyed a warm relationship with her father-in-law, but recently their interactions had taken on a different quality. There was an intensity to his attention that she found both flattering and slightly puzzling during their drive to the hospital. Catherine reflected on the changes she had observed in the royal family dynamics over the past few months. Camilla, who had always been a steady and reliable presence at family gatherings and public events, had become noticeably absent. When she did appear, she seemed subdued and withdrawn, a stark contrast to the confident woman who had won the hearts of the British people. At the hospital, Catherine threw herself into her work with the enthusiasm that had made her such a popular member of the royal family. She sat with young patients, listened to their stories, and brought genuine joy to children facing serious medical challenges. The hospital staff marveled at her natural ability to connect with people, her way of making everyone feel seen and valued during a quiet moment between ward visits. The hospital director mentioned how much the staff appreciated her visits. "You have a gift," he said. "The children always brighten up when you're here. It's not just the novelty of meeting royalty, they genuinely respond to your warmth and sincerity." Catherine smiled at the compliment, but it also made her think about the different ways members of the royal family carried out their duties. She had always admired Camilla's professional approach and her dedication to various causes, particularly those supporting literacy and domestic violence survivors. The Queen Consort had carved out meaningful work that made a real difference in people's lives. That evening, Catherine attended a private dinner at Buckingham Palace, one of the smaller gatherings that Charles occasionally hosted for family and close associates. She arrived to find Charles already in conversation with several guests, but he immediately broke away to greet her personally, taking her arm and introducing her to people she hadn't met before. Throughout the evening, Catherine noticed that Charles seemed to seek her out for conversation more than usual. He asked her opinions on various matters, from charitable initiatives to diplomatic protocols. His attention was flattering, but she also sensed an underlying tension, as if he was trying to fill some void in the evening's dynamics. Camilla arrived late to the dinner, citing a previous engagement that had run longer than expected. She looked tired and seemed to participate in conversations without her usual enthusiasm. Catherine watched as Camilla and Charles interacted with polite courtesy, but little of the warmth and intimacy that typically characterized their relationship. During coffee and conversation after dinner, Catherine found herself in a group that included both Charles and Camilla. She tried to engage the Queen Consort in discussion about a literacy program they both supported, hoping to bridge whatever gaps seemed to have developed. But Camilla's responses were brief and distracted, and she excused herself early, claiming fatigue. After Camilla left, Charles seemed to focus even more intently on Catherine, asking detailed questions about her upcoming projects and offering suggestions for new initiatives. His interest was genuine and his advice valuable, but Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening beneath the surface of these interactions. On the drive home, William asked about the evening. Catherine shared her observations carefully, not wanting to gossip but genuinely concerned about what she had witnessed. Something seems wrong between your father and Camilla, she said gently. I'm worried about both of them, but I'm not sure if there's anything we can or should do. William was quiet for a moment before responding. I've noticed it too. Father seems different lately, more focused on work, but also more restless, I suppose. And Camilla has been declining more invitations than usual. Catherine spent the remainder of the drive thinking about the complex dynamics within the royal family. She had always felt fortunate to marry into a family that, despite its public role and ceremonial obligations, maintained genuine personal relationships. The idea that Charles and Camilla might be experiencing serious difficulties troubled her deeply. As they arrived home, Catherine realized that she was being drawn into a situation that was both delicate and potentially significant. Her relationship with Charles was important not just personally but for the future of the monarchy, and any changes in family dynamics would inevitably affect everyone involved. She resolved to be supportive while remaining careful not to overstep boundaries or make assumptions about private matters that were ultimately none of her business. The afternoon shadows grew longer in Camilla's private sitting room as she sat, surrounded by sympathy cards and letters from well-wishers. Word had somehow leaked to the press that she had been feeling unwell, though the palace had been careful to describe it only as minor fatigue requiring rest. The public response had been overwhelming. With thousands of messages expressing concern and support, she picked up one letter after another, reading heartfelt wishes for her recovery and expressions of gratitude for her years of service. A grandmother from Yorkshire wrote about how Camilla's literacy program had helped her granddaughter learn to read. A domestic violence survivor from Manchester credited the Queen Consort's advocacy work with giving her courage to leave an abusive relationship. These letters reminded Camilla of why she had embraced her royal role so completely. Despite the personal sacrifices and constant scrutiny, the work itself was meaningful and impactful. She had found ways to use her position to make genuine differences in people's lives, particularly for causes that might otherwise struggle to gain attention, but lately, even the most rewarding aspects of her duties felt overwhelming. The knowledge that Charles's attention had shifted away from their relationship made everything else seem less important. She found herself questioning not just her marriage, but her entire place within the royal framework. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Her lady-in-waiting entered with tea and the afternoon's correspondence, including several official invitations that required responses. Camilla looked through them mechanically: a charity gala, a university visit, a reception for military families, all worthy causes that would normally have received her immediate attention. Shall I prepare acceptance letters for these events, Your Majesty? Her assistant asked gently. Camilla hesitated. Each commitment felt like another performance she wasn't sure she had the energy to give. The thought of putting on public smiles and making small talk while her personal world felt so uncertain seemed impossibly difficult. Let me review them overnight, she replied. I'll give you decisions in the morning. After her assistant left, Camilla walked to her writing desk and began composing a letter she never intended to send. She wrote about the loneliness of royal life, about the way personal relationships could become casualties of duty and obligation. She described the particular pain of feeling invisible to someone who had once seen her as essential. The act of writing helped clarify her thoughts. Even though the words would never be read by anyone else, she realized that her withdrawal from public life was partly a test. Would Charles notice her absence? Would he ask questions? Would he show concern for her well-being beyond the official requirements of maintaining appearances? But as days passed without meaningful contact from her husband, Camilla began to understand that her absence was being managed rather than mourned. The palace machinery continued to function smoothly, adjusting schedules and redistributing duties without any apparent strain. She was replaceable in ways she hadn't fully understood before. The realization was both liberating and devastating. If her presence wasn't essential, then perhaps her absence wouldn't be tragic either. She could step back further, reduce her role to the absolute minimum required by protocol, and see if anyone beyond the press and public would truly miss her contributions. Her phone rang. displaying Catherine's private number. Camilla stared at it for several rings before answering. Surprised by the call and uncertain whether she was ready for conversation. "Camilla, I hope I'm not disturbing you," Catherine's warm voice came through clearly. "I wanted to check on you personally, not through official channels. How are you really feeling?" The genuine concern in Catherine's voice nearly brought Camilla to tears. Here was someone who had noticed her struggles and cared enough to reach out personally, something her own husband hadn't done. "That's very kind of you to ask," Camilla replied carefully. "I've just been feeling a bit overwhelmed lately. Sometimes a step back is necessary to gain perspective." Catherine seemed to understand the careful language. "If there's anything I can do, please don't hesitate to ask. I know we don't often have opportunities for private conversation, but I want you to know that I'm available if you ever need to talk." After the call ended, Camilla felt both grateful for Catherine's kindness and painfully aware of the irony. The woman who was increasingly capturing Charles's professional attention was showing more personal concern for Camilla's well-being than Charles himself. That evening, Camilla made another decision that surprised her. Instead of staying in her rooms as she had been doing, she dressed for dinner and made her way to the private dining room. If Charles was there, she would attempt a real conversation. If not, she would at least have made the effort. The dining room was empty except for the staff preparing the table. Charles, she was informed, was working late in his study and had requested a tray be brought to him there. The pattern that had been developing was now complete. They were both avoiding each other, both retreating to separate corners of their shared life. Camilla ate alone, surrounded by the formal grandeur of centuries-old royal tradition. The portraits on the walls seemed to judge her, reminders of all the royal consorts who had come before, women who had found ways to fulfill their duties regardless of personal happiness. She wondered if this was simply the price of loving a king, that the crown would always come first, and personal relationships would always be secondary to the demands of duty and state. Perhaps she had been naive to think their marriage could maintain its intimacy and warmth under the pressures of monarchy. The state reception room at Buckingham Palace gleamed under crystal chandeliers as dignitaries from across the Commonwealth gathered for the annual diplomatic event. King Charles moved through the crowd with practiced ease, engaging in conversations that touched on trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and matters of mutual interest between nations. Catherine arrived precisely on time, wearing an elegant emerald dress that complemented her naturally graceful bearing. She had prepared thoroughly for the evening, reviewing briefing notes about each attending delegation and the current political situations in their respective countries. Her approach to royal duties had always been meticulous and professional. Charles caught sight of her immediately and made his way through the crowd to greet her personally. His face lit up in a way that several observant guests couldn't help but notice, a warmth and animation that seemed more pronounced than his usual diplomatic courtesy. "Catherine, you look absolutely radiant this evening," he said, taking her hand and holding it perhaps a moment longer than protocol required. "I'm particularly hoping you'll have a chance to speak with the Australian delegation. They've expressed specific interest in your early childhood development work." As the evening progressed, it became increasingly clear that Charles was orchestrating opportunities for Catherine to shine. He guided conversations toward topics where her expertise and passion could be displayed, stepped back to let her take the lead in discussions, and made sure she was introduced to every person of significance in the room. Catherine handled each interaction with the skill that had made her such a valuable member of the royal family. She spoke knowledgeably about education initiatives, asked thoughtful questions about different countries' approaches to social challenges, and demonstrated the kind of engaged curiosity that made people feel their work and perspectives were valued. But she also noticed something that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Charles's attention to her was so focused and intense that other guests were beginning to take notice. She caught several exchanged glances between ambassadors and heard whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. "Your Majesty seems particularly energized this evening," one diplomat mentioned to Catherine during a quiet moment. It's wonderful to see the king so engaged with someone who clearly shares his passion for Commonwealth relations. The comment was innocent enough, but Catherine sensed undercurrents she didn't like. She began to realize that Charles's obvious preference for her company was creating exactly the kind of speculation and gossip that the royal family worked so hard to avoid. Midway through the reception, Catherine asked about Camilla's absence. Charles's expression grew more formal as he explained that the queen consort was still recovering from fatigue and had decided not to attend evening events until she felt completely well. These occasions can be quite demanding, he said, and Camilla felt it was better to rest than to attend when she wasn't at her best. But Catherine heard something in his tone that suggested relief rather than disappointment. It occurred to her that Charles might actually prefer these public appearances without Camilla present, enjoying the freedom to focus his attention elsewhere, without the complications of managing a strained marriage in public. During the formal dinner that followed, Catherine found herself seated at Charles's right hand, a position usually reserved for the most important foreign dignitary or, in Camilla's absence, the senior female member of the royal family present. The conversation flowed easily between them, covering topics from environmental conservation to artistic patronage. Charles seemed more relaxed and animated than she had seen him in months. He laughed at her observations, sought her opinions on various matters, and made it clear to everyone present that he valued her perspective highly. Catherine couldn't deny that the attention was flattering. But she also felt increasingly aware that they were treading on dangerous ground. After dinner, as guests moved to the reception rooms for coffee and informal conversation, Catherine made a conscious effort to circulate independently. She didn't want to encourage whatever dynamic was developing, and she certainly didn't want to fuel speculation about her relationship with the king. But Charles continued to seek her out, finding excuses to bring her into his conversations and seeming genuinely disappointed when she moved away to speak with other groups. His behavior wasn't inappropriate by any clear standard, but the intensity of his focus was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Near the end of the evening, Catherine found herself in a small group that included Charles and several Commonwealth representatives, discussing cultural exchange programs. The conversation was animated and substantive, and Charles deferred to her expertise on several points, clearly impressed by her knowledge and insights. Princess Catherine has been instrumental in developing new approaches to youth engagement, he told the group. Her work represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking the Commonwealth needs for the future. The praise was professional and appropriate, but delivered with an enthusiasm that made Catherine acutely aware of how visible their interaction was to everyone in the room. She began to understand that she was unwittingly playing a role in whatever was happening between Charles and Camilla. On the drive home that evening, Catherine felt troubled by what she had experienced. William asked about the reception, and she found herself struggling to explain her concerns without sounding presumptuous or disloyal. "Your father was very attentive tonight," she said carefully. "Almost too attentive. I'm worried that people might draw the wrong conclusions." William was quiet for a moment. "You think he's using you to fill some gap that Camilla's absence has created?" Catherine nodded, relieved that William understood her concern. "I don't think it's intentional, but yes, and I'm not comfortable with that role, especially when I don't fully understand what's happening between them." The morning newspapers spread across Charles's breakfast table told a story he hadn't expected to read. Headlines speculated about the growing prominence of Princess Catherine in royal duties, noting her increased presence at state functions and the king's obvious confidence in her capabilities. Some articles mentioned Camilla's continued absence from public life, drawing careful but unmistakable contrasts between the two women. Charles set down his coffee cup with more force than intended. He had been so focused on ensuring important events were properly represented that he hadn't considered how his reliance on Catherine might be interpreted by the press and public. The suggestion that he was somehow replacing Camilla with his daughter-in-law was both absurd and deeply troubling. His private secretary entered with the morning briefings, but Charles found himself unable to concentrate on matters of state policy and international relations. The newspaper coverage had forced him to confront something he had been avoiding. His marriage was in serious trouble, and his attempts to compensate by focusing elsewhere were creating new problems. He thought about the previous evening's reception and tried to remember his interactions with Catherine objectively. Had his attention been inappropriate? Had he somehow been sending signals he hadn't intended? The possibility that he was unconsciously using her to avoid dealing with his marital problems was both embarrassing and alarming. After breakfast, Charles made an unusual decision. Instead of proceeding with his scheduled meetings, he asked his staff to clear his calendar for the morning. He needed to have a conversation he had been postponing for far too long. He found Camilla in her sitting room, reading correspondence from various charities and organizations. She looked up when he entered, and he was struck by how tired she appeared. The vibrant woman who had once been his closest companion seemed diminished, as if she was slowly disappearing from their shared life. "Camilla," he began, then found himself uncertain how to continue. "I think we need to talk." She set aside her letters and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was wariness there, but also something that might have been hope. "Yes," she said simply. "I think we do." Charles sat in the chair across from her, the same chair where he had spent countless hours over the years, sharing thoughts and concerns, making plans, simply enjoying each other's company. Now the familiar space felt awkward and formal. "I've been reading the morning papers," he said. "Some of the coverage about Catherine and about your absence from recent events. I realize that my actions may have been misunderstood." Camilla's smile was sad but not bitter. "Charles, the press will write what it chooses to write. That's not what this is about." He leaned forward, trying to bridge the distance between them. "Then what is it about?" "Because I know something has changed, and I know I'm partly responsible, but I'm not entirely sure what I've done wrong." For a long moment, Camilla didn't respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "You haven't done anything wrong, exactly, but you haven't done anything right either. We've been living parallel lives for months now, Charles. We share meals when our schedules permit. We appear together when protocol requires it, but we've stopped really talking, stopped really seeing each other." Charles felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. He realized that their relationship had indeed become a matter of duty and routine rather than genuine connection. "I didn't want this to happen," he said. "I never intended for us to become strangers." "Nor did I," Camilla replied. "But the Crown demands so much attention, and lately you've seemed more comfortable giving that attention to Catherine than to me. She's fresh and enthusiastic about royal duties, while I've become tired and somewhat cynical about the endless obligations." Charles started to protest, but Camilla held up her hand gently. "I'm not criticizing either of you. Catherine is wonderful, and she brings energy and new perspectives to everything she touches. You've always valued those qualities, and it makes sense that you would want to include her in important events." She paused, looking out the window at the gardens they had once explored together, but watching you light up around her while becoming increasingly distant from me has been difficult. I've felt like I was becoming invisible, not just to you, but to the entire royal framework we're part of. Charles reached across the space between them and took her hand. It felt smaller and more fragile than he remembered. "You are not invisible to me, Camilla. You never could be. But I think I've been so overwhelmed by the demands of being king that I've forgotten how to be a husband." She squeezed his hand gently. "And I've forgotten how to be anything other than queen consort. We've let our roles define us so completely that we've lost track of who we were before we had titles and duties." They sat in comfortable silence for the first time in months, holding hands and acknowledging the distance that had grown between them. It was a moment of honesty that felt both painful and necessary. "What do we do now?" Charles asked. Camilla considered the question carefully. "We remember that we chose each other long before we chose this life, and we decide whether we want to choose each other again, despite everything that comes with it." Charles felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. The conversation wasn't a solution, But it was a beginning, the first honest exchange they had shared in far too long. 3 weeks after their difficult but necessary conversation, Charles and Camilla walked together through the palace gardens in the early evening light. It had become their new ritual, these quiet walks where they could talk without the pressure of formal schedules or public expectations. The simple act of moving together, sharing the same pace and direction, had helped them begin to reconnect. The changes had been gradual but meaningful. Charles had restructured his schedule to include more private time, delegating some responsibilities and being more selective about which events truly required his personal attention. Camilla had slowly returned to her public duties, but with a renewed sense of purpose and a clearer understanding of her own boundaries. Catherine had noticed the shift immediately. The intensity of Charles's attention had returned to appropriate levels, and she felt relief at no longer being caught in the middle of whatever had been happening between him and Camilla. The three of them had developed a more natural working relationship, with Catherine contributing her expertise while Charles and Camilla presented a united partnership. The press had also taken notice of the changes. Though their coverage was respectful and positive, stories now focused on the renewed energy that both the king and queen consort brought to their joint appearances, and the obvious warmth between them that had been absent for several months, but the real transformation was visible only to those closest to them. Charles had rediscovered his ability to be present in conversations rather than distracted by endless obligations. He asked Camilla about her thoughts and feelings, listened to her responses, and made decisions that took her needs into account alongside official requirements. Camilla, for her part, had found ways to re-engage with royal life without losing herself in the process. She had become more selective about her commitments, choosing to focus deeply on causes that truly mattered to her rather than accepting every invitation out of duty. "I've been thinking about something," Camilla said as they paused beside the rose garden, "about how easy it was for us to drift apart without really noticing what was happening." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "We became so focused on performing our roles that we forgot we had a relationship that existed separately from those roles." Exactly. And I think that's a trap that many couples in public life must fall into. The external demands become so overwhelming that the personal connection gets pushed aside until there's almost nothing left. They continued walking, passing gardeners who were tending to the late-season flowers. The staff acknowledged them with respectful nods but didn't interrupt, understanding that these evening walks were private time. "Do you think we would have found our way back to each other without that confrontation?" Charles asked. "Or would we have continued drifting until we were complete strangers?" Camilla considered the question seriously. "I don't know. I hope we would have, but I'm not certain. It's frightening how easily we can lose touch with what really matters when we're caught up in the machinery of royal life." That evening, they hosted a small dinner for close friends and family members, including William and Catherine. The atmosphere was relaxed and genuinely enjoyable, with conversation flowing naturally between personal topics and broader discussions about current events. Catherine observed the interactions with quiet satisfaction. The tension that had characterized royal family gatherings for several months had dissolved, replaced by the kind of warm familiarity that made even formal occasions feel comfortable and authentic. After the guests departed, Charles and Camilla sat together in the library, reading quietly and occasionally sharing interesting passages or observations. It was an old habit they had rediscovered, this comfortable companionship that required no performance or agenda. "I've learned something important from all this," Camilla said, closing her book and looking at Charles. "I learned that I can't wait for other people, even you, to make me feel valued and important. I have to know my own worth and defend it." Charles set aside his own reading material and gave her his full attention. "And what have you concluded about your worth?" "That it doesn't depend on how busy my schedule is or how many public appearances I make. My value comes from the relationships I build, the genuine difference I can make in specific situations, and my ability to remain true to myself regardless of external pressures." Charles reached for her hand. a gesture that had become natural again rather than the awkward formality it had been during their difficult period. "I've learned something too," he said. "I've learned that being king doesn't mean I have to sacrifice every personal relationship for the sake of duty. The crown is important, but it's not everything. And the best way I can serve it is to remain grounded in the relationships and values that make me who I am." Outside the library windows, the palace grounds were peaceful in the darkness, with only security lights illuminating the pathways. Inside, a king and queen consort had rediscovered each other and, in doing so, had found a way to balance the demands of their public roles with the needs of their private relationship. The crisis had passed, not through dramatic gestures or public statements, but through honest conversation, genuine effort, and the recognition that even royal marriages require constant attention and care. They had chosen each other again, with full awareness of the challenges they faced and the commitment required. To meet them together, their love story would continue, tested by future pressures but strengthened by the knowledge that they could survive difficulties and emerge closer than before. In a world of endless obligations and public scrutiny, they had carved out space for something purely their own, a partnership built on understanding, respect, and the kind of deep affection that makes all other challenges manageable.